Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Ready to get into some fascinating stuff today?
Always.
Okay, so today we're going deep on a topic that I think will resonate with a lot of our listeners. Tangible assets in family businesses.
Oh, yeah.
You know, how to make sure those assets don't turn into family feuds when it's time to pass things on. You guys sent in some great material from Professor Allan Galvão.
Oh, yeah, he's fantastic.
A Brazilian expert on this whole topic, and I'm really excited to dig in.
Yeah, this is a question that I think so many families struggle with.
Yeah.
We think of legacy as, stories or values.
Right.
But all the tangible stuff.
Right.
The land, the equipment, even grandma's antique collection.
Yeah.
I mean, these are things that are deeply intertwined with both the business's history and the family history.
It's more than just stuff, right?
Absolutely.
Professor Galvão calls these tangible assets and defines them as physical goods with economic value that can be easily identified and evaluated. Sounds simple enough.
It does.
But I have a feeling it gets complicated fast.
Oh, it can.
Yeah.
While a tractor is a tractor.
Right.
Is that antique collection really worth what Uncle Joe thinks it is? Right.
Right.
That easily evaluated part can be a real sticking point.
Yeah.
Especially when emotions come into play.
Speaking of emotions, let's not forget that Professor Galvão highlighted a scenario where siblings inherit farmland, but have totally different ideas about what to do with it.
Exactly.
Some want to stick with traditional crops. Others are thinking, dollar signs, cattle ranching. And then there are those who just say, let's sell the whole thing off.
Right. Liquidate it.
What a recipe for disaster.
And it happens more often than you'd think.
Right.
Yeah. Different generations, different risk tolerances, and sometimes you just can't get past that good old-fashioned sibling rivalry.
Yeah.
Plus, those assets might hold, deep sentimental value.
Oh, yeah.
Which makes it even harder to be objective.
Okay, so before we jump into all of that potential conflict, let's take a step back.
Okay.
Professor Galvão has this two-step process for actually identifying the tangible assets in the first place, which seems deceptively simple.
Right.
He starts with what he calls physical verification.
Yeah.
And he says it's more than just making a list.
You're not just taking inventory.
Right.
Yeah.
You need to inspect the condition of things.
Exactly.
Figure out who officially owns what. Sole ownership, shared ownership.
Is it fully paid for? Are there liens on it?
Right. And even, is there money still owed? Are there loans against those assets?
Yeah. Are there outstanding payments?
So it's like creating a really detailed map of your tangible world.
Yeah.
Making sure you really know what you're working with. Then comes the part that I think might make some people sweat a little.
Yeah.
Document analysis.
This is where you got to dig in.
Right.
Deeds, purchase records.
All that fun stuff.
Contracts, anything that legally proves ownership and clarifies any financial obligations.
Right.
Trust me, meticulous record keeping now can prevent massive headaches down the line.
Oh, yeah. A stitch in time saves 9, right?
100%.
So we've identified the assets. We've got our paperwork in order.
Check.
Now comes the fun part.
Yeah.
And I'm using that term very loosely, accounting. Professor Galvão mentions a couple of nuances that might throw people off, like depreciation.
Depreciation is so important to understand.
He uses the example of a computer, which I think is brilliant because we all get that that expensive laptop you bought a few years ago worth a fraction of its price now.
Yeah.
And it's the same with many tangible assets.
Absolutely. Wear and tear, obsolescence.
Yeah.
Changes in the market. All of these things impact an asset's value over time.
So it's not just about things getting old.
Right.
It's about understanding how those market forces and technological advancements impact an asset's value. What about this idea of asset write-off?
Oh, yeah.
That sounds a bit intimidating.
It's less about fear and more about reality.
Okay.
Let's say you have a piece of equipment that's so damaged or outdated.
Right.
It's basically worthless. You might need to remove it from the company's books.
Okay.
That's a write-off.
Okay.
And it reflects the fact that the asset no longer holds any real value.
Okay.
It can also happen if you sell an asset for less than its recorded value.
Okay. I think I'm starting to see why Professor Galvão emphasizes all these accounting details.
Yeah.
It's about having a clear and realistic picture of what your assets are actually worth.
That's exactly it.
Yeah.
And, understanding these concepts is power, especially when it comes to making informed decisions about succession planning.
Right.
and avoiding those nasty surprises.
Yeah, speaking of potentially nasty surprises, let's dive into the family dynamics part of this equation.
Yes, because even with all the right paperwork and valuations, emotions, and individual aspirations can really complicate things.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's say we have this family farm.
Okay.
How do we keep it from becoming the battleground for a family feud when it comes time to divide it up?
Well, Professor Galvão suggests a few key things.
Okay.
Starting with thorough asset mapping.
Okay.
And he's not just talking about the basic inventory we talked about earlier.
Right.
This is a deeper dive.
Okay.
We need to understand who owns what percentage. Are there any outstanding debts or lay-ins on specific assets, and even noting the emotional significance that might be attached to certain items?
But what if the siblings can't agree on a realistic valuation? Especially for those sentimental items.
Oh, yeah.
That just sounds like a recipe for conflict.
Absolutely. That's why Professor Galvão stresses the importance of realistic valuation.
Yeah.
And this often involves bringing in an unbiased third party.
Okay.
Especially when you're dealing with items that might have more sentimental than market value.
So it's like getting a reality check, like someone who isn't emotionally invested, which I imagine can be tough, but ultimately save a lot of heartache.
Oh, yeah, 100%.
Then comes the part where we make it all official, formalizing ownership.
Yeah.
This is about eliminating ambiguity. Who legally owns what needs to be crystal clear?
Right.
We're talking updated deeds, clear contracts, and ideally everything reviewed by legal professionals to avoid any future disputes.
Absolutely.
And then the big one, creating a division plan.
The big question.
Right. How do we actually decide who gets what?
Yeah. And this is where it gets really interesting. Professor Galvão mentions tools like trust wills, even setting up a holding company to manage shared assets.
Now, are holding companies always the best solution?
No, not necessarily. The best approach really depends on the specific needs and goals of the family.
Okay.
The complexity of the assets involved and the level of trust, or lack thereof, between family members.
So there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Not at all.
It's about finding the structure that minimizes that potential for conflict.
Right.
And sets everyone up for success.
Exactly.
But I'm curious about those intangible assets that Professor Galvão mentions.
Oh, yeah.
How do you even begin to document something like reputation?
That's where things get even trickier.
Right.
Intangible assets like brand recognition, customer loyalty, even a business's reputation can be incredibly valuable.
Yeah.
Maybe even more so than the physical stuff in today's economy.
And I imagine they're much harder to quantify, provide fairly.
Exactly. Think about it.
Yeah.
How do you split a family business's reputation down the middle?
Yeah. How do you assign a monetary value to years of built-up trust and goodwill?
It's tough.
Sounds incredibly complicated.
It is, and it's something that deserves careful consideration in any succession plan.
Right, because while those tangible assets might be easier to grasp, it's often the intangible ones that really drive a business's long-term success.
100%.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, from identifying those tangible assets to navigating the potential minefield of family dynamics. But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the emotional side of all of this.
Yeah, we can't afford to ignore that, can we?
No.
At the end of the day, we're not just talking about dividing up possessions.
Right.
We're talking about families, legacies, dreams.
It sounds like finding that balance between preserving wealth and preserving relationships is key.
It's absolutely essential.
We were just talking about how intangible assets can be even trickier than the physical stuff.
Yeah.
To help us visualize this, I keep thinking about that family-owned bakery example Professor Galvão mentions, the one with the sourdough recipe that's been passed down for generations.
Oh, it's a perfect example.
Right.
That sourdough starter is practically part of the family tree at this point.
Right.
But how do you put a price tag on that? It's not just about the ingredients.
Right.
It's about the years of experience.
Right.
The subtle techniques, the reputation for quality that comes with it.
You can't just hand someone the recipe and expect them to replicate years of tradition and expertise.
Exactly.
So how do you even approach that in a succession plan?
Well, one strategy is to focus on knowledge transfer.
Okay.
Make sure that the next generation actually has a chance to learn from the masters.
Right.
To understand the nuances that make that bread so special.
So it's about more than just teaching them how to bake.
Yeah.
It's about passing on the passion, the commitment to quality, that deep understanding of what makes this bakery unique in the eyes of the community.
Exactly. And that's where clear communication and a shared vision becomes so important.
Right.
Having open conversations about, what the business represents, what the family wants to preserve, and how those intangible assets will be nurtured going forward.
These intangible assets are almost like living things, right? They need care and attention.
A deliberate effort to pass them on.
That's a great way to put it.
And just like tangible assets can depreciate, those intangible assets can erode.
Oh, absolutely.
If they're not actively managed.
A business's reputation can be damaged. Customer loyalty can fade.
Right.
The brand can become irrelevant if it doesn't adapt.
Which raises the question, how do you prevent that erosion?
Yeah.
How do you make sure these intangible assets keep thriving even as the business transitions to new leadership?
It takes a proactive approach.
Okay.
Documenting processes.
Right.
Creating systems to maintain consistency and quality.
Okay.
Investing in marketing to keep the brand relevant.
Right.
And perhaps most importantly, empowering the next generation to be stewards of that legacy.
So it's about honoring the past while embracing the future.
Yeah.
Finding that balance is crucial.
It is.
We need to remember that while the tangible assets provide that foundation, those intangible assets are what breathe life into the business. They are the heart and soul.
Yeah.
The secret sauce.
Okay. I'm starting to get a much clearer picture of this whole intangible asset thing.
Yeah.
But are there other concrete examples beyond the bakery?
Of course.
Because I'm having trouble wrapping my head around how some of this stuff would work in other industries.
Let's say you have a family-owned construction business.
Okay.
One of their most valuable assets is their network of relationships.
Oh, yeah.
Suppliers, subcontractors, government contacts. These connections are built on trust and years of collaboration.
You can't just write that into a will.
No, you can't.
Those relationships are gold.
Right.
But I can't imagine those contacts would be thrilled to just be handed off to someone new.
No.
Especially if they've worked with the older generation for years.
Right. It requires a thoughtful strategy.
Okay.
Maybe gradually introducing the next generation into those interactions.
All right.
Giving them a chance to build their own rapport and credibility.
Yeah.
It could involve joint ventures or mentorship programs where the younger generation shadows the older one, learns the ropes, and earns that trust.
It's about showing those contacts that the younger generation is competent, reliable, upholds the same values that forged those relationships in the first place.
Exactly. Another example could be a family-owned tech company.
Okay.
Their intellectual property patents, software algorithms. That's a massive intangible asset.
That's their life's work, right?
It is.
Their innovation, their competitive edge.
Absolutely.
How on earth do you divide that up fairly?
It can be very complex.
Right.
You might consider clear ownership agreements, licensing arrangements, or even separate entities to manage different aspects of that intellectual property.
Okay.
The key is making sure everyone understands the value of those assets and how they contribute to the overall success of the business.
Sounds like there's no easy answer.
No.
Every family, every business is going to have unique circumstances.
That's the truth. There's no one-size-fits-all solution.
But recognizing that those intangible assets exist, understanding their value, and making them a central part of the succession plan, that's that crucial first step.
That's it.
Before we move on, I want to circle back to something Professor Galvão touches on briefly.
Okay.
The emotional element.
Ah, yes, the human factor.
Right.
It's what makes this whole topic so fascinating and so challenging.
Because at the end of the day, it's not just about assets and numbers. It's about families, legacies, dreams.
Exactly. And that's why Professor Galvão's work is so valuable.
Yeah.
He reminds us that succession planning is about finding a way to balance the practicalities of asset division with the emotional needs of the family.
It's about preserving wealth, yes, but also about preserving relationships, honoring history, and making sure that family legacy continues to thrive for generations to come.
That's powerful.
That's a powerful thought. And it leads us nicely to our next point. We'll be exploring some practical steps that families can take to navigate this process successfully.
Yeah, that's good.
We've been exploring this complex world of tangible and intangible assets in family businesses and how to navigate the often tricky terrain of succession planning.
It's a lot.
It is. But let's get practical.
Okay.
What can families actually do to make this process smoother, less stressful, and maybe even, dare I say, harmonious?
Well, Professor Galvão doesn't explicitly say this.
Okay.
But But it all starts with honest and open communication.
Okay.
Family members need to be able to talk about their hopes for the future, their fears, their expectations, all of it.
That sounds great in theory.
Yeah.
But in reality, that can be really tough.
It can.
Especially when you've got those long-standing family dynamics,
Right.
maybe some simmering sibling rivalries, and potentially very different opinions on how things should be run.
Yeah.
Where do you even begin to have those conversations?
You're right. It's not always easy.
Yeah.
But creating a safe and structured environment can help. This might mean bringing in a neutral third party,
Okay.
like a family business advisor or a skilled facilitator, to guide the conversation and make sure everyone feels heard.
So someone who can act as a referee,
Easily.
keep things civil, and maybe even help translate between different communication styles?
Yeah, different perspective.
What else can families do to lay the groundwork for a successful transition?
Professor Galvão really emphasizes early and ongoing education.
Okay.
And this applies to both generations.
Okay.
The older generation needs to understand the legal and financial implications of succession planning.
Right.
And the potential pitfalls of not addressing these issues head on.
What about the younger generation, though? I mean, they might be thinking retirement inheritance, that's decades away.
Right, they're not thinking about this now.
Right. What's the message for them?
It's about getting involved now,
Okay.
learning the business inside and out.
Okay.
Its history, its values, how it actually operates. The more knowledge they have, the more empowered they'll feel to participate in those big decisions down the road.
So it's like Professor Galvão is saying, don't wait for things to be handed to you.
Yeah.
Be proactive, ask questions, be an active part of shaping the future.
Exactly. And that early involvement can prevent a lot of conflict later.
Yeah.
When both generations feel invested in the process, feel like their voices matter, you're much more likely to have a smooth and equitable transition.
Okay, communication education.
Check and check.
But what about concrete steps to actually put a plan in place?
Well, Professor Galvão talks about the importance of thorough documentation.
Okay.
This means a complete inventory of all assets, both tangible and intangible, and not just a simple list.
Right.
Remember those nuances we discussed?
Right.
Ownership structure, payment status,
Yep.
even the emotional significance attached to certain items, capture all of that.
So for that antique grandfather clock, we'd note that it's worth $5,000, but also add that it's been in the family for 100 years.
Right.
And that Uncle Joe is particularly attached to it.
Exactly. Those details matter
Yeah.
when it's time to divide things fairly.
Right. And don't forget about the intangible assets.
Of course not.
Documenting processes, client relationships, the brand story, all of that helps preserve the business's value and ensures a smoother handover.
Absolutely.
This sounds like a lot of work.
It can be.
Is it realistic for families to do this on their own?
It can be complex. Getting professional guidance is often wise.
Okay.
Attorneys specializing in family business succession,
Okay.
financial advisors, even family therapists, they can provide invaluable support.
So it's like assembling a team of experts who understand the unique challenges families face and can tailor their advice accordingly.
Precisely. It's about having people who can help facilitate those tough conversations,
Right.
create legally sound agreements, and make sure the transition is handled with sensitivity and fairness.
Speaking of sensitivity, how do you keep those personal feelings, those sibling rivalries,
Yeah.
from derailing the whole process?
That's where those family therapists or skilled facilitators could be so helpful.
Okay.
They can help families establish healthy communication patterns, address underlying conflicts,
Right.
and find ways to express their emotions constructively.
So it's about acknowledging those feelings exist,
Yeah.
giving them a space to be aired safely, and then working together to find solutions that respect everyone's needs and interests.
Exactly. And remember, this isn't a one-time event.
Right.
Succession planning is an ongoing process that requires regular check-ins, open communication, and a willingness to adapt
Yeah.
as circumstances change.
It's almost like tending a garden.
Yeah.
You're constantly nurturing those relationships, making adjustments as needed, and ensuring that the seeds you plant today will flourish for generations to come.
I love that analogy.
And ultimately, that's what successful succession planning is all about.
Yeah.
Ensuring the business survives and thrives. Its legacy is honored, and those bonds between family members remain strong.
Well said.
We've given our listeners a lot to think about today.
We have.
From identifying and valuing those assets
Yeah.
to navigating the complexities of family dynamics and creating a solid plan for the future.
A lot to unpack.
Any final thoughts you want to leave our listeners with?
The biggest takeaway is that succession planning isn't just about the money. It's about the people.
Yeah.
It's about preserving relationships, honoring family history, and ensuring the business continues to be a source of pride and unity. It can be a challenging journey.
It can.
But with careful planning, open communication, and a commitment to working together, families can make this transition a success.
Yeah.
And build a legacy that will last for years to come.
Beautifully said. That wraps up our deep dive into the world of tangible assets and family succession.
Great discussion.
As always, we encourage you to keep exploring these topics. Have those crucial conversations with your families.
Yeah, talk to each other.
And seek out expert guidance when you need it. Until next time, fellow deep divers, keep learning, keep growing, and keep those family businesses thriving.